This is Making Better Decisions. I'm your host, Ryan Sullivan. Decisions are where rubber meets the road for organizations. Each week, we'll be learning from people who are on the front lines of turning raw data into better outcomes for their organizations. This show is sponsored by Canopy Analytic, helping companies make better decisions using data. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Today's guest did his undergrad in civil engineering, has experience both within industry and as a consultant domestically here in the US and with an international footprint. He has worked for companies such as Unilever and Deloitte. Please welcome VP of Business Data Analytics and Insights at Hitachi Vantara, Bhupi Arora. Welcome to the show, Bhupi.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm excited. This is a very interesting space, and I'm excited to share my thoughts with you.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time. What is one thing you wish more people knew about using data to make better decisions?
Yeah, I think Ryan, that's a good question. But unfortunately, I don't know if if there's one thing which matters in the world that we live in today. I think there are like 10 different facets, from which you can actually approach this question. However, if there was still one thing which I would like the listeners of this podcast to focus upon, it would probably be this, right? That in today's environment, making sense with the data that we have today without drowning in its chaos is probably what matters the most. And I'll try to elaborate on what I mean by that, right? We are living in a world today where over 90% of the data that exists today was created in the last 2 years, right? We have every minute, we have hundreds of thousands of tweets being sent out, hundreds of hours of YouTube videos being created, millions of emails and Slack messages going out. We have, with IoT devices, social media, cookies, and emails, there is almost an explosion of data. And I think the biggest challenge and opportunity for all of us in terms of driving better decisions with data, where it lies, is in figuring out how do we connect all this information and consume it in a consistent and coherent way. Without making it too long-winded, right? One more thing I'll highlight, right? It's actually reminds me of this movie that was released a couple of years back called Everything Everywhere All at Once. I don't know if you've seen it or not. You being a sci-fi nerd, I believe you probably saw it, right? There were multiple themes that were explored in that movie, but one of the key themes that they talked about was the fact that when there's a lot going on and when you try to focus on everything all at once, all it leads to is chaos and confusion and a giant messy black hole, right? And I think that's probably relevant to the data situation where we are at today. So what it leads to is I think two things which you should keep in mind, right? One is data scarcity is probably no longer an issue with most of the organizations and companies and with world in general today. It's data abundance. How do we connect all this data that exists in silos, in fragmented systems, in structured and unstructured data that is getting generated day in and day out? That's one piece of it. And the second piece of it is how do we do it responsibly? We are all under immense pressure these days to adhere to compliance requirements, to privacy rules, to using AI in ethical manner and so on. And honestly, none of us want to end up as a headline for the new data privacy scandal. So I think those are some of the key considerations, in my view, that we need to keep in mind as we think about making better decisions with data these days.
We've had the conversation on here a couple times about whether the conversation started talking about the scale and velocity of data or not. We've had the conversation on here very, very frequently about how analytics professionals frequently get ourselves in the hot water by not having admittedly very narrow scope with the initiatives that we go after. One of the big things that I harp on is having that scope be very, very focused on business outcomes, right? I am unaware of very many enterprises that engage in analytics outside of a business scope. Like I know that there are some like cool newsletters and like a little bit of data-driven investigative journalism and like forensic, like there are places, but for the most part, we're driving business outcomes. But even still, as you were talking, it prompted this idea for me. I feel like a lot of the marketing materials around data and some of the new AI stuff is like, well, that's the point of data. We're supposed to be able to see it all. Like, we'll sift through all your stuff and surface these things that you couldn't see otherwise. And even though I say that in slightly a mocking tone, like, I think there's a piece of that that I want. There's some portion of it that's true. Like, some of my biggest success stories are around that type of open-ended analysis. We found something you couldn't find otherwise. Tell me a little bit about balancing the overzealous marketing promise of being able to see things no one else can see and the realism of not wasting money.
Right. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, right? There is a fine balance in my view that has to be struck between these two extremes, right? And I think it has to be driven from the top in any organization as to what is it that you're trying to achieve with these objectives. My experience tells me that as people, as humans, there are two things that I always keep in mind, right? First of all, as humans, at least I don't think about things in terms of columns and rows and facts and figures. Those are important things. I have to, that's what I do for a living. But I think about it in terms of stories and in terms of narratives and in terms of what what business outcome am I trying to achieve. That's one. The second thing which I also have to keep in mind is very pertinent to what you mentioned right now, that at the end of the day, if we try to go and boil the ocean, there is, we may find something, but there is a higher probability that we may actually not find something. So in today's environment, when there is just a flood of information, and there's a flood of AI and all these tools that exist out there which claim that they can actually help you boil the ocean, I still believe that you get the best ROI by actually solving for the point problems that you have to help you achieve the ROI objectives or business outcomes that you're trying to achieve, which helps you get the investments or which helps you get the buy-in from the stakeholders to then go and do those cooler things around boiling the ocean or, looking into, stuff that you were talking about. Let's go and investigate this stuff, right? Let's go and look at trend analysis. Let's throw this AI agent out there and see what it comes up with in terms of correlation analyses and whatnot. But to me, the fine balance that needs to be struck, in my opinion, is it starts with actually first finding where the value resides by going after very narrow and focused use cases, and then perhaps expanding the aperture when you have gained the buy-in, when you gain the investments, and when the leadership is there with you to say, oh yeah, go ahead and explore these things.
Do you think analytics has an internal marketing problem?
I think in some organizations, so I've seen analytics struggle in a lot of organizations. In some organizations, they do a far better job, versus the others. But in a lot of organizations, analytics has struggles and continues to struggle, and there are multiple reasons to it, right? First of all, in my view, first reason is that analytics as a function, people or organizations still haven't figured out what is the best way to structure that, right? Is it
Mm.
supposed to be a federated model? Is it supposed to be centralized? Is it supposed to be decentralized? There are certain capabilities that are supposed to be centralized versus not. Ultimately, everybody goes after saying, oh, let's go after a hybrid model. But what does that hybrid model actually mean is still sort of a black box. So to me, there is a little bit of a definition of what does analytics mean, and what happens when you don't have a clear definition of what an analytics function means. Where should it reside? How should the operating model be? What happens with this confusion is that a lot of the functions end up creating their own analytical silos, so to say. And because of that, the challenge that we run into in most of the places that I've seen, again, in today's world, where data has been democratized, where a lot of data is available, is that each individual silo will do their own analysis, will come up with their own answers, which will create a very good picture of each silo. But when you take a comprehensive view of the entire picture, and take a few steps back, that's when you realize that whether these things are adding up or not, whether this is actually relaying a picture which adds up with the overall business performance or not. And I think that's where people miss the mark. So very long-winded way of saying analytics absolutely has a marketing problem, But that to me is almost a symptom. The real problem is that organizations still don't know how to actually structure the analytical teams, right? They know how to structure the data teams for the most part, but analytics as a function is still quite decentralized, quite federated. People don't know what the expectations should be. They don't know whether, how much of business knowledge should be built within the analytics team versus not. And because of this confusion, because of these kind of variabilities,
If you could wave a magic wand based on your experience and change every organization into a given structure that you think would be most efficient, what would it be?
I wish such a magic wand existed. And I think I've seen at least I would say 5 to maybe 10 different organizations toying around with analytics as a function and operating model and so on. And even amongst those, I can't say that there was one structure that would have uh, answered the ask for each one of them.
Hmm.
And the reason why I say that is because the starting point for each of those companies was very different. Even my current employer, their starting point is very different. The operating model in which they are operating with the rest of the functions is very different, and the expectations from the analytics function, that's very different. If I were to bifurcate it into like only just, let's say you were to say, no, we simplify this for me. You're making it sound like a consulting answer, right? What I would say is that if I were to bifurcate it into just two, let's say, archetypes of organizations, right? One archetype would be very simplistically put, companies that were born in the natively digital world, the Netflixes, the Amazons, the Ubers of the world, versus the companies that are sort of, I wouldn't call them behind the curve, but they were not born natively digital. They have already had some infrastructure around data. They have had analytics. They've had operating models, which they are sort of trying to figure out how to work in this world, in this ever-changing world of new data. If I were to bifurcate the world into these two archetypes, then I would say the objectives that the natively digital companies are going after with analytics, they they seem to be a little bit different at this point of time. They a lot of their focus with analytics, with data, is in driving top line growth. How do I actually use analytics as a differentiator, as a capability for me to drive my top line, to drive my revenue? And we can see that those examples, right? You can see those examples with what Netflix has done with their recommendation engines. You can see those examples with what Amazon has done with their recommendations and whatnot. Whereas and I'm oversimplifying this, right? But on the other side, if I look at the archetype, the all the other companies, all the other organizations, all the other industries, right? Those companies, for them, analytics is still being seen as a function where we can drive some efficiencies, where we can find, oh, my margin went down. What happened? Help me do some descriptive analysis. Help me do some deep dive. Oh, I need to figure out how to take out some costs from the business. Go and explore those situations. Help me figure out where are we. Help me benchmark it with other companies and help me figure out where am I higher on the cost versus low. So I think the objectives are slightly different, and then they drive different sort of behaviors from these organizations, and so the operating models and the structures of these have to be different. But again, I would caveat this by saying this is a significant oversimplification. There are examples of use cases across the archetypes.
Let's dig out of the oversimplification and into the meat and potatoes. So, the thing that I was noodling on as you were talking was I had a guest on here recently, Mark, that talked about the percentage of the population that is naturally lent to this type of data work. It's certainly not everybody. I think he quoted some like high single digit percentage of folks that are going to be, capable of being engaged in analytics type work. Even if we expand that estimate, like let's say it's a super low estimate, we double it, right? Okay, well, we're somewhere in between 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 people are going to be really good at this stuff. I wonder how organizations can lean into that can every organization really do a good job with analytics? Or are some, because of their structure, destined to fall into that chaos that you started the conversation with? I know I'm leading the witness here a little bit, but let's go with it.
Personally, I'm a hugely optimistic guy. So I would like to believe that there must be a way to save every single organization, right? So that not a single organization falls into the pit of chaos. But I think the the challenge, the organizations which may run into that issue would be those which are not thinking about their strategic objectives that they want to achieve with data. I think that's the key point, right? If you have an alignment and if you know what you're trying to achieve with data and analytics, then creating a roadmap and actually going after that, it's it, there are so many tools, there are so many capabilities that are available in today's environment that's not hard. Even the point that you were making around talent, I agree that there is a scarcity of that talent that we have seen in the last 2 decades, right? Will that scarcity continue? I'm optimistic that it will likely not. With the democratization of data, with more self-service tools, with AI agents coming into place, the way we interact with data will probably evolve. There'll be fewer people required to write Python code than to actually ask the right questions and interpret that information.
There we
Right?
go.
Right. So I think that gap can be filled. But as long as you know what question you're solving for, that imagination and that empathy from a talent standpoint and from leadership down standpoint is 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 where I feel if an organization can't answer that question, then I think they will end up in that situation where there's chaos and there are black holes and whatnot.
Yeah, I think a lot about this particular question when I think about, interestingly enough, like marketing for my own company.
Mhm.
So when I was just pure nerd, which is kind of what I like being. I like just sitting on my keyboard with my headphones on, listening to music and, making cool things on a computer. I've been forced to think a lot about not just the underlying value proposition, but how do I communicate that and to which audience? Like, which audiences are most capable of digesting this? And I really think that it comes down to those who are in a position and have a strong desire to engage in different decision making pathways and a lot of action, right? And I think this ties directly to the point that you just made around, when I start, I mean, sure, if somebody comes to me and is like, Ryan, we want to pay you money and you build a report. Okay, cool. Fairly transactional, not really ideal. Like, there are probably cheaper people you can go to do that than me. But anytime we're doing something larger, it has to start with a conversation exactly about exactly what you just spoke about, which is what are your business goals? Then from there, okay, what are the questions and the decisions that you need answers to in order to drive towards those goals? Then we go out and we find the stuff that helps you make those decisions most accurately. So, talk to me a little bit. I share your optimism. Like I said, I was leading the witness with the last question. I do share your optimism. Maybe that's the curse of the consultant, but I don't think it's a hard sell that there are some people, some non-zero amount of people that are, shall we politely say, resistant to change. How do we convert them?
And I think that's the not even $1 million, that's the $1 billion question, right? And that's the challenge that I don't think that there is a silver bullet answer. And I say that because I have personally faced that, right? More so as a consultant than within an organization, and you would probably attest to that as well, right? I used to be a firm believer of the fact that if you show the facts, then if you show the facts and you put it in the right narrative, and if you don't hide any facts, then change management becomes easier. People will follow. They will actually, do what makes sense. Uh, but what I have seen over and over and over again is that change management is actually a lot more than just a simple fact of sharing facts, right? It's a lot more than sharing the facts and then expecting the people to actually come to the table. And that's a place where your basic change management principles could apply, but in today's world where narratives can be built, where even when the facts are available, and I'm just going to use that term, right? When you have news, you have fake news. When you have facts, people sort of, refute those facts, right?
Alternative facts.
Alternative facts, that's the term, right? In this environment, it's very difficult for us to change people's attitudes, people's behavior just by facts alone. What has worked for me in the past, it is again not a silver bullet, is actually empathy. That has been more important for me than facts, because what it has helped me do is help me me put myself in the shoes of those stakeholders and figure out what is driving that resistance, and then have a conversation that and most often than not, we as humans are driven by certain motivations, right? It is either self-preservation, or it is about growth, it is about promotion, this. There are probably a handful of these motivations that drive all of us. It's a matter of having a discussion, having that empathy to figure out, how can I make it a win-win situation in that discussion, to actually get people to at least listen to the facts, right? Then what decision, are made on that is supposed to be consensus driven anyway. But I haven't found a single silver bullet answer to this, right? Instead of just saying that it is a change management exercise. In fact, one of the key things that I believe is going to happen for data leaders as we move further and further into this new world of AI and whatnot, is that our jobs are going to become a lot more around of change management and communication and collaboration. And of course, the skill sets and talents and all those are going to evolve. Our roles are going to we're going to start calling ourselves AI scientists and all those fancy titles. But the jobs are going to evolve a lot more into change management agents than they were even previously, because data is going to get more and more democratized. Self-service tools are going to be more easily available. It's going to be less important that you can actually do the job than to actually be able to communicate and collaborate and work with everybody to drive towards the right decisions. I think that's the challenge that lies ahead in front of all of us.
If our role transitions from doing analysis and building tools to communicating data principles and information to the rest of the organization, do we end up with like a hollow black box analytics function? And do we like that idea? Maybe we do.
So I think that at least in the foreseeable future, right? It's hard to predict what's going to happen 5 years down the line, right? In today's world, maybe even 2 years down the line, right? but I think in the foreseeable future, there is still a lot of value in the analytical skill sets and capabilities that exist out there, right? Agree that all the prescriptive and the predictive models, LLMs, natural language processing models, they are becoming easier to implement, easier to sort of adopt and do things with, right? But it's not going to take away the need for us to curate the data, for us to figure out the right questions, to figure out, are we actually eliminating the biases from the data? Are we solving for the trade-off? In any kind of model that we use, there's always a trade-off between explainability versus the complexity of the model. The data that we are feeding in is correct or not, whether it is accurate or not, whether it is, have we actually, curated the data for any inherent biases in the information or not. I think there's still a lot of value left in that piece of it. And there's going to be a lot of value left in actually interpreting the results, making sure that the results actually adhere to and are answering the business objective question. I think in the near foreseeable future, I do believe that that's one way in which the analytical function capabilities will need to evolve. Uh, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, I don't know. In fact, that's a thing that I keep wondering about because I have a 10-year-old kid and I don't know what are the things, what are the skill sets that I should sort of help him build. I do believe that at the end of the day, at least at this point of time, I don't think that machines have gotten to a stage where they can do the imagination and the empathy piece of our brain on their own. We can ask them questions, and we have a tendency to anthropomorphize these engines, right? So we believe that it's almost like a human talking back to me, right? I still believe there is some time before they get there. So I think from a talent and from the perspective of how this thing is going to evolve, how the analytical capabilities are going to evolve, as long as you have critical thinking abilities, as long as you can imagine, what the solution to the problem could be, how would actually I solve it in an empathetic manner, right? And how would I communicate these results, the answers to whomever, right? Whoever the stakeholders are. I think we will continue to provide the analytical capability. Will continue to provide a lot of value to the organizations. Once these skills start waning off and they start getting taken over by the chat GPTs of the world, I
Mhm.
I believe we will have to evolve.
I know that every podcast we have a different guest, and it seems like a high percentage of them keep ending up back at this place with like all roads leading to right now the human element is critically important to the way that data, analytics, decisions, action, business change, all of those things. And then this kind of question as far as how long will that continue to exist for? And I don't know entirely how much of that is my fault because I'm internally asking that question, or how much that is really the intrinsic question of data and analytics right now in 2025. But it reminds me, I'll throw out a literary reference because you appear exceptionally well read. I'm a huge Kurt Vonnegut fan. I find him exceptionally amusing, dark humor and satire and all that. And some of his satire, it's a little bit like I don't know if you're familiar with like the Simpsons stuff where like people joke that the Simpsons is predicting the future. I think frankly that's just a recognition that like good satire does a good job of talking about the human condition, and the human condition doesn't change a ton. I guess maybe I should take that as some solace with our AI conversation. But Kurt Vonnegut had a story called Player Piano, which is pretty amusingly named because it's a piano that plays itself, where in this future society, everybody had kind of gotten split into these two categories. So one were like all of these PhDs, and they had, in order to be kind of like a member of this elite class of society, you had to have a PhD, and they were all extremely self-important. But then at the end of the day, they would just like take punch cards and put them into computers and then take them out, and like they weren't really doing anything. And then the other class of society, they were called like the Rex and Reeks, and they basically just like broke stuff down and build stuff and like held recreational events, and then they would all just kind of like hang out in the streets like do whatever. And so I wonder if we talk about a future with more AI enablement, right? Some sort of singularity, AGI for those cognitive tasks like empathy, like creativity. Personally, I think one of the big turning points is going to be some sort of like self observation. One of the things that makes humans exceptionally good and smart relative to other things is that we observe things working and not working in other creatures, and we're able to detect those patterns. And um, I'm not entirely sure that AI training models have cracked that. And I think that when they do, it's going to be a major step change because they'll start training themselves at an increasing rate. But let's imagine that we get to a place where AI can do all of this, right? It finds all these amazing things, it makes all the right decisions. Somehow, like what happens to the landscape? Like, does competition exist? Now it's just who has the money for the smartest AI. Like, tell me your Vonnegut tale. And I know it's going to be an optimistic one because you said that, but tell me your tale of what happens here. What's at the end of the road?
Yeah, and it is an optimistic one, right? Because I also spend. By the way, I'm also a Vonnegut fan. I haven't read that book though.
10 out of 10 recommend. Very funny.
Okay, I'm gonna do that.
And sad, a little sad. As all Vonnegut, like you're laughing and kind of deeply troubled at the same time.
No, but I think again, I have a bit of an optimistic view. Again, at least for the foreseeable future, what you're saying um, is a possibility. Over the course of next maybe decade or 2 decades or what have you, right? It's very hard to predict what that world would look like. But at least for the foreseeable future, here's my perspective. That a lot of these AI related capabilities and use cases that we talk about, what we're talking about is, are there applications at the tip of the spear, right? We're talking about companies that, again, that are born digital, natively digital, that have all their data available in the cloud, that can do all these funky things. You can throw AI agents on it and they can come up with some very interesting ideas and whatnot, right? But
Yeah.
to me, granted, those are some of the biggest market cap companies in the world today. But there is the rest of the body of the spear, which is running the economy, which is running the rest of the industrial world. There are so many countries, even outside of US, which where the pace of industrial revolution is still so far behind that they have to catch up. And I feel optimistic based because there's a lot of opportunity with for us to do things to actually bring a lot of those organizations, countries, societies, environment, right, all those things towards the tip of the spear. I think it's easy to paint a dystopian future based on the tip of the spear of those specific companies who are sort of at the leading edge of doing these transformations, of coming up with these things. But lot of organizations, and I'm not using the term company here, a lot of organizations have data infrastructure, have analytical infrastructure, which is quite basic, which is quite rudimentary today. For them to actually, there are certain situations where they'll be able to leapfrog using these AI agents. There are certain situations where we'll have to actually help them build this data infrastructure for them to get to the next level. So I see your point, right? There are, for those companies which are ahead in the game, they are gonna they are gonna either annihilate competition, or it's gonna be a race to the who can afford the best engine, who can afford the best quantum computer and things like that. But there's a lot of opportunity in the rest of the world, and a lot of good things can happen with AI, with data infrastructure, the way things are evolving. And
Mhm.
I, just out of my own selfish interest, I'm looking towards that. I'm not just looking towards the front to keep my eyes open, but I'm looking towards all this other stuff where that's an opportunity rich environment.
I personally am of, so long as we're engaging with this idea of, like the Skynet dystopian future, I personally am of the belief that there are rails, like guardrails on a path that continues what I would call like successful and productive economic development. Now, there are absolutely sad and horrific stories that come from economic development. I kind of share your opinion. I tend to be fairly optimistic. Crime and violence have never been less prolific in human history. Life expectancy, with a couple sad exceptions, has never been better. Like in general, like these major statistics that we look at to gauge the health of the human race seem to be improving over time. This is a good thing. So, provided that, we don't hit some sort of hiccup that takes us outside of those guardrails, right? Like, I think, it doesn't make sense for somebody to own and operate a shop if there's no law and order. Someone just comes in and steals all their things. So then me that doesn't want to go steal things can't go buy them because they all got stolen. So I do think like there are certain guardrails and structures, but so long as we as a society, and I liked how you differentiated between companies and organizations. I think, hopefully, we have social institutions and, enough good people in the world to keep things between those guardrails. And if we do, it seems like a recipe for helping the human condition to continue to grow better. So I share your optimism, and I'm happy to hear that because sometimes it's gloom and doom and terror.
Yeah, yeah. And I think sometimes even I do that, right? I do that a lot of times actually, that we are privileged. I find myself to be privileged to be living in the US, to be living in a society where we are getting to see this pace of change, these all these innovations, all these things happening in real time. But sometimes I have to remind myself that US is not the world. There is an entire world out there, and a lot of those lives are gonna get affected by what is happening, how we do things. Uh, you know, all these AI related technologies that are coming in, all the data infrastructure that are being put in place. What all can we do from a food standpoint, from healthcare standpoint, from environment standpoint? I believe again, I'm very optimistic. I think there, even if there are only a few good people, still left in the world, I think there's a lot that can be done, even with just a few good people.
Yeah, I agree with that. I know that we just touched on it a little bit, but one of my favorite questions to ask people is what is hard right now? I think we've probably covered, like the dangers and the futurism and the AI stuff. So let me constrain what I don't usually constrain more to the data and analytics and business decision making portion of this. What is particularly hard right now, and what are you doing to meet the challenge?
So again, I can take this question, Ryan, in multiple different ways, right? But I'll try to be very specific, right? Let me say what is hard right now from analytics standpoint. It's how do you scale analytics in an environment again, where data is so fragmented. Again, I think probably 10 years back or 12 years back when I used to do like consulting assignments, this issue was there, but it wasn't to the degree that it exists now. Every single question that can be answered by 10 different data points, 10 different views, 10 different ways. And how do you bring those fragmented and siloed systems, people, processes together to answer and provide one coherent vision, one coherent picture of the business is very hard from analytics standpoint. From AI standpoint, what is hard personally for me right now is keeping up. It's not easy to keep up. The pace at which things are evolving, the pace at which AI technologies, tools, uh, you know, just the magnitude, at which this thing is exploding, it's very difficult to keep up with what is relevant, what is not relevant. Every single day there is like a new tool, not even one, probably a dozen new tools that are getting launched in the market, and everybody claims to be better than the other. And that's why I go back to the analogy that I was giving at the beginning. As a human myself, when if I try to look at all these things in one go, maybe in some when in some time in the future there will be some AI agent that will help me actually get a comprehensive view of everything. But at this point of time, if I try to do that, all I get is confusion and chaos. And that's why what I try to focus on is point problems. What is it exactly that we are trying to solve for? Let's articulate that. Let's get aligned on that. Let's go and fix that. Let's find out. Once we have that ROI, once we know that it's driving value, then if you want to go and do some boiling of the ocean on the side, we can do that. But to me, these things are really hard. How do you scale analytics in this fragmented ecosystem? And how do you keep up with the pace of change? It's unbelievable.
I love how you managed to bring that full circle. So this actually brings me to what I was talking about a little bit earlier with some of the marketing that I try to do for my organization here. And the advice that you get all the time when you're trying to communicate value proposition is not to scale, right? It's to get extremely narrow and focused. And then you can really clearly communicate value. And obviously, that has differing degrees of applicability depending on the organization. So if I were to try to say to, an organization like Amazon, well, you really should just focus on answering this one type of question. It's like, well, we're pretty big, so we got a couple questions going at one time. Um, but I do think that your advice of, at least for right now, focus on what's most important. Put blinders on. kind of hate to say it, like circling back to what feels like that lost promise, but like the objective reality right now is like we really need to put on blinders and focus exclusively on value. Um, so yeah, I think everybody's dealing with this, and I like your recommendation. We've gotten the opportunity to learn a lot from you. I have, at least personally, found this exceptionally engaging and informative so far. Help us get to know you a little bit better.
Sure. Yeah. So, of course, my name is Bhupinder. I go by Bhupi, as you introduced myself in the beginning, and I live in the Washington D.C. Area. I've been calling this area home for the last what now 11 or so years. I grew up in India, in a small town called Bhopal. I was born and brought up there. If you search it up, it has a claim to fame which is not very nice actually. It was a place of chemical environmental disaster several years back when I was just born. That's the only claim to fame it had, but it was a beautiful, nice little town when I was growing up over there. I live in I moved to the States in 2014 and live here with my wife, with my 10-year-old son, and a dog. I have a West Highland Terrier. She's really good. So, no, and just one other thing which I'll add is that it's been amazing being on this podcast. A lot of these things that I think about and worry about, not just from a job standpoint, but even just from the future of our world standpoint. It's good to actually bounce off these ideas and discuss them with others, and also find an avenue to share them with others, so that I can get other people to sort of tell me where I'm wrong or right in my perspectives. So I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do that. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I kind of feel the same way. When I started the podcast, I was like, oh, I've been doing this for a decade. Like, certainly I don't know everything. There's definitely things for me to learn, but like having this many conversations with this many people that I think are objectively smarter than me has shown me how much I have to learn always, not just in my field of analytics, right? It's like I put in my 10,000 hours, I think comfortably, I've been doing this, like I understand this stuff really, really well. And like you mentioned, it's just this, and I guess this circles back to my point about, one of the things that AI could really learn to do better is like that self-observe, a little bit of groupthink, even though sometimes humans overdo that. Just that opportunity to bounce ideas and hear other people's perspective just grows and enriches. So yeah, the thanks are mutual. I really appreciate it. If anybody wants to reach out and talk to you a bit more, take the conversation in a new direction, what are the best ways to reach out and connect with you?
So I'm available on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to reach out to me. Of course, I'm happy to share my email address also if anybody reaches out to me on LinkedIn or my phone number. But the best way to reach out to me is probably on LinkedIn.
I love it. This has been an exceptionally enjoyable conversation. It's not every day that I get to work a Kurt Vonnegut reference into my data podcast.
Oh, I learned. I learned.
Thank you for that opportunity. And for anybody that's listening, I want you to know that I resisted the urge to hijack this entire podcast talking about the Dune book behind his head on the bookshelf. So you're all welcome for that. But Bhupi, thank you so much for sharing your time and experience and awesome energy with us today.
Sounds good, Ryan. Thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
I also want to make sure to thank the audience. This has been a fun, fast hour for me, so hopefully you found it to be the same. If you did, please make sure to tell a friend about the podcast, share the episode, like, subscribe, give us a review, hopefully a good one. It really helps to keep us cranking. Bhupi, thank you again so much for the time. This has been another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Thanks for listening. That's a wrap for today's episode of Making Better Decisions. For show notes and more, visit makingbetterdecisions.live. A special thank you to our sponsor, Canopy Analytic. Canopy Analytic is a boutique consultancy focused on business intelligence and data engineering. They help companies make better decisions using data. For more information, visit canopyanalytic.com. There's a better way. Let's find it together and make better decisions. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next week. Peace.